It all starts with a coin toss. Shane, a young man in his office, is choosing who to fire today and bases his decision on the fateful toss of a coin. Miles, the main character of our movie, is asked to come in shortly after. He is a very positive fellow, so much so that he maintains his positivity throughout the most illogical and obviously immoral firing interview. Shane justifies his decision by saying that it's strictly financial, but Miles knows that he's a top earner in this organization. Clearly, this is either a lie or a bad joke. Unfortunately for him, he notices a coin on the table and suddenly realizes that his fate was decided by a coin toss. Now, he becomes angry, but Shane seems like the kind of man who would never admit his wrongdoings. Finally, Miles decides to yield, and as he begins packing up, he observes how someone else is already in his position, someone who has clearly not been adequately chosen. As he drives his way towards home, we see that his entire life is purely comical. If pathologically self-oriented people weren't enough in his workspace, his girlfriend, Melissa, seems to be as egotistical as it gets. This trait of hers is so obvious and so evil that it's almost comical. It's funny to see how Miles endures her temper tantrum as he comes home and breaks the news to her. The girl is so upset that instead of empathizing with her boyfriend, she begins a rigorous ambush, attacking his entire being. Miles simply walks to his couch and decides to go to sleep while the screaming of his girlfriend still hurts his eardrums. And he's so tired that he manages to do so. When he wakes up, however, the house is already emptied. There's nothing left. His girlfriend is gone, and with her, every decorative item they owned. When he reads Melissa's letter, his heart and sorrow explode out of him. He begins putting together a letter himself then. But as days pass, no significant words appear in his mind. He begins selling most of his stuff, not including his red vintage car, to accumulate some money and goes on several unsuccessful job interviews. Finally, fire eats everything that reminds him of Melissa, and his desperation seems almost impossible to deal with. We see him dressed up as a Statue of Liberty in the next scene as he plays a lottery in a supermarket. A large line of customers is moving around restlessly as he loses everything but refuses to pay the penny for it. The cashier doesn't care much. She's just happy that this freak is gone. Miles is sitting on the edge of a wishing fountain when we learn that he works as an advertiser here. This is why he's dressed up like that, but suddenly an idea pops into his head. He decides to make a wish and flicks the coin out of his fingers into the pond. He realizes then that the fountain is filled with other people's coins too, and he becomes sure he will never have to work again in his lifetime. Miles calls his best friend, Jack, in the next scene and shares his idea with him. They could really make a lot of money out of this since the government often doesn't clean all the fountains. Jack is super reluctant. Miles was out of reach for a week, and now he comes to him with this ridiculous plan to make money. And to add to his seriousness, he's dressed up as a Statue of Liberty. It takes a full day of trying to convince Jack, only for him to say that he will think about it, but it's enough for Miles. He's truly enthusiastic about this idea, thinking that it will make him his own boss. The next day, he was working. To collect a significant amount of money out of a wishing fountain seems to have been actually possible. Miles is buying coffee in the supermarket with this money in the next scene when he notices an old man checking his car outside. When he walks up to him, the old man asks him to spare some change, and he does so. He clearly has plenty to spare. He even gives this man a lottery ticket, and even though the latter never plays it, he happily accepts this gift. Miles decides to walk away then, but he realizes he can learn a lot from this man, and he turns around to get to know him better. His name turns out to be Deerwood, and he seems to have owned the same car that Miles now drives. The latter asks him if he knows any fountains around, but Deerwood seems unable to help him out in this. Still, their interaction is full of friendliness and respect. As he drives away, Miles hopes to see this old man again. The business is booming. He collects all the coins he has gathered so far in the next scene and starts cleaning them when Jack knocks on his door. His life philosophy seems to have been completely changed after his conversation with Miles. He breaks the news to Miles that he quit his job and is now ready to take a risk. He is eager to go down in flames with his best friend now if it is necessary. He wants to do something unique, and he will do it of his own volition. In short, he's in. They count the coins that Miles has gathered so far and realize that they are going to need far better technology to properly manage their income. For now, they just head out to immerse themselves in their new full-time job. Days pass, and countless buckets are filled with coins. This business not only proves to be prosperous, but it turns out to be a lot of fun too. Eventually, after a good bit of hoarding, they cover all the fountains in their area and are now ready to wait for a month until they are replenished again. Shortly after, however, they came up with a better idea. Miles should go on a working trip to cover more unknown, unconquered ground. People wish everywhere, and their dreams cost a lot. Miles wants Jack to tag along with him while he travels around the country, cleaning the wishing fountains dry. But Jack says that someone must stay here to take care of the money they've already accumulated. They should also hire one more person to help them out. This trip of Miles will truly be a mythical one. However, before he goes, he has an idea. He already knows a perfect man to hire. He will have to use all of his convincing prowess for this one. but somehow, he manages to convince Jack to accept Deerwood into their business. The latter isn't your average statistical beggar. He knows how to make his argument and how to articulate himself even better than Jack. He also seems to be at peace with where he's at right now, so as surprising as it is for Miles, he has to put a lot of effort into convincing him to join too. Finally, Deerwood finds their idea very interesting and decides to go along with them. In the next scene, as he explains how to take care of the legal part of their business, we learn that Deerwood was once a businessman. And when he comes up with the idea to go for the entire state instead of having only their city in mind, Jack starts to become defensive. They do not even know this guy, and he's been in the business for only a few minutes, but he's already changing things up. It is only natural for Jack to protest against this, especially when he prefers to go careful and slow in this job. But thanks to Deerwood's clever way with words, he manages to ease his mind. The latter seems to have made some bad decisions in the past, but he seems to be at peace with himself. This is why he doesn't take Jack's insults seriously. The next morning, Miles goes on his first ever hunting trip outside the city and leaves his house and all their money to Deerwood and Jack. One day, after successfully breaking his back to collect as many pennies as possible, he arrives in front of an awe-breaking picture. In a beautiful park, he spectates how his money is made for the first time. He sees a girl standing at the edge of an old fountain near a calm lake as she makes her wish and parts with a coin. Miles approaches her with his equipment and says hello to her. The girl says hello back and starts preparing to leave as Miles settles in. He decides to make a conversation, and after a while, the girl understands that Miles is here to clean the fountain. She asks him superstitiously not to take her coin out, and since it is impossible to determine which one is hers in this enormous bunch of pennies, Miles decides to postpone cleaning this particular fountain. He pretends then to remember that it is his lunchtime and asks her to tag along. The girl seems to like the way about him. She seems to think that Miles works here on a regular basis, watching the seasons change, and she's jealous of his inspiring job. Miles, however, doesn't want to lie to her, so he tells her the full truth that surprises her a lot. It might not seem like the most prestigious of work, but at least Miles can now say that he isn't miserable. Neither the girl seems to live here. She says that she's on a sort of a vacation, just passing through this park that she used to visit a lot when she was a kid. Neither of one seem to have a clear destination in mind. Before walking away, Miles asks for her name, and we learn that as symbolical as it is, it closely resembles a penny. Her name is Penelope, and Miles promises to her that her penny will stay in the fountain for today until it's properly heard. He hopes to see her again tomorrow. In the next scene, we see the conflict between Deerwood and Jack getting deeper. When Miles calls, Jack shares to him that he has an idea he's going to tell him when he gets back. Once the call ends, however, he refuses to share this idea to Deerwood. He still doesn't trust him and is openly hostile towards him. Deerwood, however, manages to always keep his cool. Now, he urges him calmly to give him a chance. Miles clearly trusts him, and Jack has no real reason to show this much hostility towards him. The latter feels a little guilty after this and shares the idea with him. He thinks hiring some freelancer to do some routine cleanings together with Miles would be a good idea. Deerwood knows that Miles wouldn't go for it, but just to get closer with Jack, he decides to follow his lead on this one. This will be their own decision, and they'll let Miles know when he gets back. The next morning, Miles makes his way towards the fountain. Upon approaching the edge of it, he lets the harmonic atmosphere fill all his cells, until suddenly Penelope sneaks behind him and scares the living soul out of him. Miles was hoping to run into her today, just not particularly in this manner. After getting him good, Penelope shares to him that she's leaving this place today, and suddenly a crazy idea pops into his head. Without thinking much about it, he asks her to go with him. Naturally, to go on a road trip with an unusual, stranger man like Miles would be an odd thing to do. This is why Penelope ponders over it for a while as Miles tries to convince her with wittily arranged sentences until agreeing to go with him. She seems ready to trust her fate and take a leap of faith. And so, as Deerwood and Jack hire another man behind his back, Miles pairs up with Penelope. They share a lot of good times while driving around throughout the jaw-dropping country and gradually draw closer and closer to one another. Time passes, and after Miles successfully ships out several boxes full of coins to Jack, he gives him a call and lets him know that he has hired somebody. His voice has a glimpse of guilt, and Jack feels even more guilty while listening, since in front of him now sits 4 men who he has recently hired behind Miles's back. Naturally, he takes this news well as Miles explains it to him that the decision was worth it. Jack doesn't tell him his side of the truth though. He just says that he has a surprise waiting for him when he gets back. Later that afternoon, Miles and Penelope are sitting in front of a railway when the latter is asked a very intimate question. Miles wants to know what she's running from. Initially, Penelope draws back, fearing not to overshare anything that would change Miles's perception of her. But once the latter lets her know that he will never think less of her, she decides to let him have a glimpse into her life. Someone very close to her got very sick, and after Penelope tried to take a risk and do something, she got carried away. Upon sharing this, she seems extremely guilty for her past decisions, and once Miles reinterprets this story in a much more positive way, she feels as closer to him as ever. As Miles sees it, she tried to do the right thing, and there is nothing wrong in that. A train passes them by then, and all its curious passengers watch as two strangers share their first kiss. 2 coins are carefully placed upon the rails in this moment, and after the train has passed, the engravings on it are completely gone. As Jack and Deerwood's relationship warms up back in the city, Miles and Penelope decide to visit the latter's family in the next scene. They are close by, and at first, Penelope is quite reluctant to reunite with them. But finally, she thinks that a short drop by wouldn't hurt. She's extremely anxious in the next scene, as she prepares to exit Miles's car and walk up to her parents. Shortly after, Miles watches as she approaches her old man and woman and greets them warmly. Their reunion is okay, and she calls Miles from distance to come on in too. When he does, however, he hears a sound of fighting coming from a closed door. Penelope's mother comes out of it then and says a friendly hello. She meets with him very warmly and asks him to help in the kitchen. As we understand, she seems to be the one suffering from lung cancer. In the next scene, the two of them, together with Penelope, start eating. The mother gets interested in what he does for a living, and Penelope tells her that Miles is a professional coin collector. Technically it is true, but the mother would never guess what his profession truly entails. The conversation is very friendly and open, but this is only until Penelope's father joins the dinner. He engages in a rigorous questioning, asking Miles questions about his line of work in a hostile manner. Then he asks him to wait outside until he discusses something with Penelope. Miles decides to show politeness and leave, but Penelope forces him to stay, saying to her dad that Miles can hear whatever he has to say to her. The father yields back now, deciding not to escalate the situation further and hand her a letter. Throughout all this time, Miles tries to maintain a smile upon his face and stay positive, and he continues to do so even when Penelope's father goes out of his way to do something extremely surprising. He dials 911 and tells Penelope that she has to face consequences of her actions so that they can become a family again. The girls scream at him, asking him not to do it, as everyone except Miles starts crying. The latter stays put and confused, and Penelope stands up to leave before her father summons police here. She hugs her mother and walks out of the door, and Miles follows her lead shortly after. He has no idea what she has done to deserve this kind of treatment from her own family, and for the first time he feels bad to have a car this noticeable. The car is overflowing with sorrow as they drive away. There is nothing Miles can say to free Penelope from this much pain. At night, before they enter their separate rooms, he lets her know that they will never have to speak what happened today. Whatever she did, Miles is sure that she did it out of pure heart and good intention. He knows that desperation can break even the best of people, and the fact that Penelope did something bad when she was under a lot of stress in the past doesn't mean to him that she's a bad person. He promises her that everything is going to be okay and enters his room. Penelope waits around for a while, drawing out the sorrow she's been holding inside while Miles was engaged in his speech. Then she reaches to her doorknob, but before opening, she realizes she doesn't want to spend this dreadful night alone. And so, she enters Miles's room and sleeps in his arms, until next morning, when she sees sun's first rays and decides to leave him. After a few hours, Miles wakes up, having no idea that the course of his life is forever changed. To make Penelope feel better, he makes earring with the coins that were placed in front of them on the rails when they first kissed each other and heads over to her room. He immerses himself into a loud and lengthy speech outside her room until 2 detectives, dressed all in black, suddenly appear behind him, asking him to move aside. He doesn't yield back right away, but in the next scene, we see him standing in Penelope's empty room alongside them. One of the detectives asks him what he does for a living, and since his line of work is only somewhat legal, he chooses not to share this information with him. He doesn't lie, however, when he stresses that he has no idea where Penelope is. Fortunately, the detectives believe him. Now it's as good a time as any to have a meaningful conversation with somebody who has gone through a difficult life. This is why that night, he calls Deerwood and opens his eyes to his future possibilities. He will find her, and once they are reunited, he will pay Deerwood another call. His job fails to provide him with the amount of excitement as before when he resumes his treasure hunting. Suddenly, while walking around a fountain, he sees a letter and picks it up. A tide of warm and painful emotion takes him away as he reads that it is written to his name by Penelope. Next morning, he calls Jack and lets him know that he's ready to change states and go national. Jack engages in a rigorous fight against himself then. He wants to tell him the truth about his conspicuous business activities, and furthermore, he wants him back. But finally, losing this battle, he urges him to go forward and keep on traveling across the US. The business keeps on growing as Penelope struggles to act against the urge of calling Miles. She sleeps in woods and works at a bar while the man she loves drains the entire nation from its wishing coins. Time passes by like this, and after a while, Miles ends his enormous venture. He comes back home and knocks on the door of his house that now is turned into a workstation where a dozen of people is employed. Deerwood and Jack greet him outside to somewhat prepare him for what's waiting inside. But as we soon learn, nothing could have prepared him properly for what was going to happen. When he opens the door and has a peek inside, his employees greet him in one mighty ahoy. Slowly, Miles draws back from the door and turns to his friends. Soon, he is introduced with all of them, and to his credit, He takes it all really well, even though most of the workers seem to be extremely weird in one way or another. They call Miles a fearless leader of supreme leader as he makes his way across the workspace, getting to know who does what. Many of the stuff that is done here seems illegal to Miles, especially the coin melting for acquiring silver. There is a special room just for that in the house now, but as Jack insists it's perfectly legal to conduct these kinds of experiments on coins found outside. All of this seems fine, but Miles cannot help himself but feel extremely angry at Jack for doing this behind his back. He started this business to avoid the office atmosphere and the heavy load that comes with it, to be free and do something fun that could also earn him a fortune. He never wanted to turn this into a full-fledged business in which he would hire other people. He feels betrayed, and to lighten the conflict between two best friends, Deerwood decides to lie that it was all his idea. Still, the fight continues as their employees eavesdrop their boss's heated conversation. In the end, Miles decides to come out and fire everybody, but once he sees the faces of the people whose fates are closely intertwined with his, he fails to find strength to do it. When silence falls in the house, there is a knock on the door. Miles goes to open it, and a tide of relief and happiness seizes him completely as he sees Penelope in front of him. The emotion is so all-encompassing that Miles even fails to notice shackles on her hands. He embraces her firmly before giving her the earring that he made earlier. Tears come to her eyes, since Penelope knows that they will have to part ways. She tells him that she has turned herself in, and it is only now that Miles notices the detectives hanging around just outside the fence. This is the moment he decides to wait for her, and as sorrowful their goodbye is, he walks back into his house full of hope and happiness. Within the course of the next scenes, he lets his employees go and fires himself in front of Jack and Deerwood too. No kind words are spoken as he walks out of his door, holding a large bucket full of coins. This is his share of profit. When he leaves, Jack blames it all on Deerwood and expresses his intention to go after Miles. The old man urges him to step back some time and give him some space to calm down, but the latter seems to be swallowed by his pride and bitterness. So, he prepares to walk away and rudely orders him not to be here when he comes back. Time passes and we see Jack taking Deerwood's advice. As the old man reunites with his daughter and Penelope spends her first days in jail, he chooses not to speak with his best friend until the heat of the situation is turned down. One night, Miles is playing slots with his share of profit when Jack approaches him from behind. His arrival surprises Miles. What happened is complex, and the recent events are creating an enormous chaos inside his mind. All he wants now is Penelope and his best friend to be back in his life. The reunion is successful. The next morning, Deerwood observes the map of United States, and an idea is born in his head. That evening, he goes up to a wishing fountain with a broom and a coin, but his body suddenly becomes numb. When Jack and Miles return home, they call for Deerwood, apologizing to him for everything that was said before, but the house is completely empty. They arrive at hospital in the next scene and are encountered with a large line of family, waiting outside to see Deerwood. The doctor comes out then and tells them that Deerwood asked to speak with them last. Miles is anxious before going in. Deerwood doesn't look good, and he struggles to speak. The young man gifts him a model of his car then. If Miles ever reaches old age, he wishes to be just as cool as Deerwood. The latter reaches to take a coin then. This is a coin that Miles gifted him once, and now he uses it to give him the most important lesson he learned from life. The coin is good, but a kind, generous human heart is better. Miles finds it hard to believe that this is happening. He hopes to see him tomorrow, and Deerwood joins him in hoping for this, but when the tomorrow comes, his heart ceases to beat. We see Miles and Jack meeting Deerwood's lawyer in the next scene. They let him know that they are ready to take care of any expenses that are going to need to be covered throughout the process of saying goodbye to Deerwood. But the lawyer suddenly says that everything has already been taken care of. A young woman enters the conference room then and introduces herself as Deerwood's daughter. The guys are more and more confused about the situation, but nothing could properly prepare them for hearing what this girl has to convey to them. As she says, her father wasn't the man they think he was. As it turns out, he was a self-made billionaire. Doctors once told him that his health granted him only a short time to live, and he decided to spend it in utter poverty to prove to himself that good people still exist. And as he shares it in his diary, his efforts turned out successful. Now all that he has ever earned is in Jack and Miles' hands, and they are asked to decide how the 90% of it will be distributed amongst the charities of their own choice, while the 10% of it will go to his 12 grandchildren. Finally, he left only 2 words to Jack and Miles: start again. They cry their heart out on a beach that evening, but looking across the horizon, they decide to fulfill Deerwood's last words. Shortly after, Penelope receives a letter in jail, letting her know that after 3 months she will be out to reunite with her loved ones. Part of the money accumulated throughout this story goes to her mother's treatment, another to her bail, and finally, the last of it is distributed amongst their past passionate employees. In the last scene, Miles sees a beautiful, old coin on a blacktop in front of his house. He takes and observes it, knowing that it is very valuable, but instead of taking it with him, he puts it back to where it was before.